question that we've posed to you this morning in our poll is, do South Africans tolerate private sector corruption? It's a very important question because the media has been tireless at exposing public sector corruption of scandal after scandal. Now, the most high-profile cases are on the president's private residence. You remember Nkandla. But it is far from the only one. The Institute for Accountability stated in 2012 already that the South African economy had lost 675 billion rand as a result of corruption since 1994. Statistics from the Public Service Commission show that public sector fraud cost the government close to R1 billion in 2011-2012. That's an increase from the estimated 130 million rand in 26 and 27 and that financial year. Now, to talk to us about corruption in the private sector, we are joined by the Director for Institute of Accountability in Southern Africa, Advocate Paul Hoffman. He's in our Cape Town studios. A very good morning to you, sir, and welcome.
Morning, Elvis, and good morning to your viewers as well. Thank you for the opportunity.
Now, Advocate, we normally hear a lot about corruption in the public sector, but what is the extent of corruption in the private sector here in South Africa? Is it a lot worse than what we can fathom?
Well, I think it's actually a false dichotomy to suggest that public sector corruption and private sector corruption are two different things. Every time there is corruption in the tender in respect of procurement of goods and service for the government, for the state, there is a corruptor and a corruptee. And all too often, it's the person in the private sector that comes to the person in the public sector and says, let's cook this tender so that there is a kickback or a bribe or an overrider or a sweetener or some sort of irregular, illegal, corrupt payment involved in that. Now, are you going to call that public sector or private sector corruption? There's a lot of corruption in the private sector. There's no doubt about it. It's a hangover from the pre-liberation days. I think the best examples that we know about are the cartel that was formed by the construction industry in relation to the 2010 World Cup stadiums around the country. Those were grossly overpriced, and the cake was just carved up very comfortably between them in a manner that was collusive, and we all know that when there is collusion, that means fraud and corrupt activity as defined in the legislation.
So what you're saying, there is no differentiation, but if we do differentiate them, if we look at the cartels and the monopolies, especially in the banks, the bread cartels and all these things, that relates to private sector, can we not then make a distinction between private sector and government sectors?
Yes, I think that the essential distinction between the two is that in the private sector, it's business, if it's purely private sector and has no relation to any activity on the part of the public sector, you're going to find a situation in which it's one firm in the private sector corruptly getting some advantage over another firm in the private sector. Most of the corruption in South Africa, however, occurs in the procurement of goods and services for the state because there is so much money involved in the procurement of goods and services for the state. We have a state that is obliged to respect, protect, promote and fulfill all of the human rights in the Bill of Rights, and that is a very expensive exercise. And in order to do it, we have a national budget of more than R1 trillion a year, and that budget gets spent not only on salaries, but also on the acquisition of goods and services. So there's less public outrage about private sector corruption because public money is not involved. If public money is involved, if your taxes and my taxes and everybody's taxes are being frittered away on corrupt activities instead of being spent in order to deliver services and realize the implementation of the Bill of Rights, then we're in a situation where public outrage is justified And the question that you're posing is, why is nothing done about corruption in South Africa? I think the answer is that our criminal justice administration is dysfunctional, which is why viewers would have been pleased to see that there is a interministerial task team looking at it. What that team needs to do is look at what the Constitutional Court has prescribed as the medicine for corruption in South Africa. They say that an independent and effective anti-corruption unit that is specialized, trained, autonomous, properly resourced, and enjoys security of tenure of office is what is required. And the court says one entity must take charge of corruption, not an interministerial task team or an anti-corruption task team or a variety of agencies. What you need to do is have specialized, well-trained people who are sufficiently independent, sufficiently well-resourced, and sufficiently secure in their jobs to deal with corruption. And nobody in the legislature or the executive seems to have adequately taken that on board, which makes me wonder whether, in your insert before we started talking, this interministerial effort is just another talk shop that is not going to get us in.
Now, we also have outdated statistics from the Public Service Commission indicating numbers from 2012, 1 billion rand being lost. Fraud cost the government close to 1 billion rand. So why do we have these outdated figures and not updated as it should be? And what is the current cost of that loss, especially in the private sector, to the economy of the country?
Yes, I think that there is a problem with statistics, but probably more relevant than dealing with numbers is the fact that the Auditor General, in the course of his work, has come across 3,000 instances of corruption in the tender system. Now, that is corruption that involves the private sector and the public sector. And he has laid complaints about 3,000 senior public servants who are involved in corruption, and nothing is done to investigate and to prosecute those complaints, even though Judge Davis, in announcing this, has indicated that they are slam dunk cases that the prosecution service should have no difficulty in proving a case of corruption against those involved in the tender irregularities.
Now, we talked about, yes, we talked.
It's inexplicable that nothing is done about those 3,000 cases, because if they are properly prosecuted, a great deal of money can be raked back from the corrupt. The money that goes to corruption gets used up on slow horses, fast cars, and loose living. It should actually be used to enhance the quality of life of the poor. In fact, a good definition of corruption is theft from the poor, because that's its effect.
Do you believe, Advocate Hoffman, that we as South Africans are turning a blind eye to private sector corruption? Advocate?
Sorry, Albert, I lost you there. I can hear you better. Can you repeat your question?
Yes. Do you believe, because we're asking our viewers that question, that we as South Africans turn a blind eye to private sector corruption and just lash out when it's all about the government corruption?
Yes, I think we do get more heated about government corruption because it's our money that's been stolen, whereas a purely private sector form of corruption would not necessarily involve public money.
But so, that would indicate...
We get heated about
yeah,
it.
but that would indicate that the bread cartel is our money that's being lost. Our money is being lost by the bread cartels, and they get a slap on the wrist, as well as the construction.
Well, in fact, the bread cartels were made to pay back the money, and they were given huge fines. So I think it's slightly more than a slap on the wrist, but that you can take up when you speak with the Competition Commission, because they were the ones who took the lead in breaking the bread cartel. Right. It's correct that the bread cartel involved stealing money from consumers and really prejudicing poor consumers. But if it's a slice of bread per loaf in price differentiation, it's quite different to the effect of millions and billions and trillions of rands going west in the procurement of goods and services by the state.
Advocate, I thank you so much for your time and joining us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
That was Director of the Institute for Accountability in Southern Africa, Advocate Paul Hoffman, in our Cape Town studios. What's your take on this? That's the question that we posed to you today.